Hello, family members. I hope you're having a nice day today. Um, I wanted to talk about white poverty and white privilege and how they can exist at the same time. Because I have, I grew up in West Virginia. I grew up knowing a lot of poor white people. And so obviously I have a lot of friends that grew up in that community and with the poverty mindset, right? And I had a friend of mine who had a revelation a few years back. Like, I never understood how living in this, economically depressed area with, kind of unstable family life, financial life, all of that, how I'm supposedly privileged because I'm white. And then I realized that there were certain things I never had to deal with, never had to worry about because I was white, and that was white privilege. It didn't have anything to do with money or whether or not you were disadvantaged in other ways. What it was about was, you know your car breaks down when you're on a long distance trip and you don't have to worry about the people at the mechanic being racist jerks who either won't help you or will be antagonistic, maybe not do, overcharge you, take longer than they need to, whatever. You don't know, you're going to be mistreated or worse. If you have to stop and get gas somewhere you don't know, or when you go to rent a house, have people, you don't have to wonder, is this landlord gonna judge me based on the color of my skin. And so you can be as poor as dirt and have white privilege still if you are white. And that's I think a tough concept for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, because we are so dismissive of poor people. We treat poor people as if they are a separate class from us, as if they are poor people, instead of just being people who are, living in poverty, and they're just essentially people. They're poor people, as in something separate from the rest of us normal people, right? But that's not how it works. There is no difference between somebody who has capital and somebody who has no capital as far as like their essential humanity. And I think that when you live with a society that's constantly telling you that you're a lesser being because you live in poverty, it makes it very easy for you to become very angry, and judgmental and defensive. I was telling my goddaughter the other day, I believe, it was a story about a friend of mine who, when she went to college, she was the first person in her family to graduate high school. And she was so proud of herself. And she got recruited to go to this expensive private school in the nursing program. And she really was in over her head, honestly. But she didn't have the support of her family. Her family actually were hostile towards her going. And when she left, they're like, oh, if it doesn't work out, don't worry, you can come back. Instead of trying to support her and help her achieve her dreams, they undercut her on every level. And she had to work so hard, to support herself. She was, basically working full-time hours and didn't have a car, so she had to like bike up and down this horrible, awful hill. And she didn't make it a full semester. And, all she got for the experience is what? Debt. And she, as far as I know, never was able to finish her higher education. Not to say that she doesn't have, a happy life. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that we take for granted that if a person wants to take opportunities, they can, and that's just not true. When you come from deep generational poverty, there is a hostility to wanting to do things differently. Like, there's this idea, like, if you want to live your life somehow differently than the way that your parents lived it, that you're condemning the way that your parents lived and saying that's lesser or not as good or whatever. And I just think that's like such a strange point of view, But when you have to come up with, you have to justify in your head, you have to find some way to make it fit that you are living in poverty, but you're not a lesser being. You're not a lesser being. And so then that has to mean that there's something different about the way that you live your life that's desirable. And that, being economically depressed doesn't mean that your life isn't great, which, honestly, that is true. Money really isn't what makes people happy. You have a stable, healthy, happy life, then, more money doesn't necessarily make it better. If you are living hand to mouth and you literally can't survive because you don't have enough money to, pay for shelter and your basic needs, well, then a little bit more money really does make a big difference in your happiness, But everything being that nuanced is just really hard for people to talk about and conceptualize. And I think that is why we have this strange relationship between the America's rural white poor and Americans black poor, because there's this like idea that poor black people living in the ghetto and blah 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 blah, and but I can tell you from firsthand experience that there's a lot of cultural overlap between people who are white, rural, and living in poverty, and people who are black, urban, and living in poverty. Like, there's way more overlap than I think people realize. There's certain types of food that are fairly common for if you're poor. Ramen noodles and boxed mac and cheese and, certain things that you're going to hear about people eating because they have no other options or no better options, right? And, then you kind of gain a taste for it, and then that's what you want, And there's, things like naming conventions. I think that the idea is that, people who are Black Americans name their children these unusual names or, give it unusual spelling. Well, that was very common among the rural poor where I grew up. And, I think that it's, maybe from the same sort of like psychological place is, I don't have much that I can offer my child, but I want to give them something to make them feel special. And so I'm going to give them this special name, And I mean, like it was like every year my mom would get her class list and we would go through and see what sort of like interesting names came up. And there were some real unique names that my mom came up with or found on these lists. And it amazes me to this day how there's just little things like that people don't notice. Where if you are living in poverty, it doesn't matter where you live. If you live in the city or the suburbs, or if you live in rural areas, it doesn't matter if you're white or black or whatever. You have far more in common with each other, far more to gain in solidarity than you have to gain by keeping this false racial hierarchy. Like if you are living in poverty and white and rural, you're just as disdained and looked down upon and prejudiced against by the elite as anybody who is a person of color or gay or trans or whatever other marginalized identity, like, and it's interesting to me that we still see so much adhesion to this radical right party by the rural white poor, people living in poverty that are white and live in rural states. And it makes me wonder, is that defensiveness? Is that the same sort of like generational thing, like how dare you suggest that we can change the system? Or, is it fear of change, making their position in society lower? Like, I think there's a lot of interesting thought processes behind that. But it also explains a lot to me why they're so blind to the white privilege that they do have, because they just don't feel privileged at all. Or if they do feel like they have some privilege due to their race, they feel like that they deserve it because it's like the one thing they have, And so they're reluctant to let it go. But they don't have that. They really don't, You really don't. You think you do, but you don't. Like, you may think that you can be a white bigot and gain some cachet by pushing minorities down. But if you're living in poverty, you're on the bottom rung. I'm sorry, And there are plenty of people with a lot of money who would love to keep you there because they believe, and they're right, the more that they hoard, the more impoverished people must exist in order for them to hoard that money. When they say that corporate profits are at all-time high, what they mean is that we, the working class and the impoverished people of this country, have been squeezed for every cent, and they're hoarding our money. Those corporate profits, that should be our money. And instead, it's going to corporations, which are people, imaginary people that these people worship, They are all about these corporations and using corporate loopholes and stuff to get away with things and just get more, They feel sorry for those types of people, They pathologically hoard. And those of us at the bottom who've been living in the generational poverty, I haven't. I won't say that, but I know a lot of people who have. You know what? I think that a lot of times those folks are better folks, because they don't have the resources to skip steps and not learn how to do things the right way. And when you see somebody who really can claw their way up from the bottom, that is so much more impressive. If somebody claws their way up from poverty to stable working class, that is far more impressive to me than someone going from middle class to rich money hoarder, honestly. Because it's a lot harder, and I think the end result is a lot healthier. But I kind of went off on a tangent there. Sorry. But I wanted to talk about this because I'm the kind of person that I grew up in an environment where it was almost entirely racially hegemonic. You know, like we had probably, I could tell you list off every single kid who I ever went to school with who was not white very easily, and maybe like fill up one hand or two, perhaps. You know, I mean, except for the extreme exceptions like Weijia Jiang from CBS News, who happened to go to the same high school as me. There's just not that many kids there who weren't white. And the ones who were either, you know, with that, like, excluding Weijia, who was an outlier, they were either their mom was white and their dad was black, and then mom had come back and dad was not in the picture. So essentially they were being raised as transracial, or they were adopted by a white family. So again, raised as transracial. So outside, you know, like, or we did have occasionally like exchange students and things like that, or people whose parents were, you know, from another country and they had come here for some work reason or whatever. You know, like, I didn't really know American black people until I was an adult. And so that absolutely skews my views on race. You know, like, my entire understanding of Black American culture was through like TV and movies and music and books and things like that for, you know, the first 20 so years of my life. You know, I knew far more African people as a teenager than African American people, okay? Like, that's the kind of world that I was raised in. And I don't think that it was better for it, you know? Like, I think that it would have been much better if we weren't so segregated. And there wasn't this, like, mystification. I think that's a lot about what happened with the white rural poor becoming so susceptible to this awful racist party that calls itself the Republican Party. You know, I think that they've been so isolated for so long from people who are different than them that they forget that a lot of people do not live their lives like them. They I think, maybe think that it's genuinely possible for everybody to live their lives the way they do. And that's just not possible. That's that's not humanity. Humanity is meant to be diverse, and there's meant to be a bunch of us doing a lot of different things, because that helps society and the human race as a whole. We're always exploring and, you know, finding new efficient ways of doing things or better ways of doing things. You know, we're always finding new inventions and new ways of looking at things and new stories and new art, you know. all of that, all of the wonders of human creation is a result of our diversity. And the fact that we have become so segregated has made us a lot easier to divide up and therefore manipulate and therefore, you know, rule. You know, it constantly amazes me that if you poll Americans, things like marriage equality and equal rights for women and gun rights and abortion rights and things like that, just all universally, people generally want those things. But we can't have them because our elected officials are unable to execute what we the people want. So doesn't that mean we are being ruled instead of ruling ourselves? So, yeah, kind of heavy thoughts, but I'm really grateful that there are so many people in Black American culture who take the time to speak to us outside of it, so that we can, you know, be a little less ignorant, even if the practical realities of this nation have left us living very segregated lives. So I've been watching a lot of FD Signifier lately, and I just wanted to call out the fact that his like Drake versus Kendrick video is freaking perfect. And if you don't know anything about what's going on, it gives you all of the context so that you can understand how truly transcendent the whole thing was. And that video does not have nearly enough views. And I don't have much reach here, but if you haven't watched it, you should. And I'm going to put a link in the description because I think it's kind of like absurd that there isn't like 15 million views on that video because it is so good. And, I mean, it's really long. It's like a mini series, basically. I did watch it over multiple settings, but still, oh my gosh, it's so good. It's so good. So, I'm glad that for people like him, because there's a lot of things that he talked about that I didn't understand or didn't know. And, you know, it may very well be that when you watch it as a white person, if you're watching anything that's got race related, there may be moments where you feel a bit uncomfortable. But I want to challenge you. You should. If you're a white person who lives in America and somebody's talking about the Black American experience and you feel fully comfortable the entire time, you might want to re-examine the way you look at things, because it's not a comfortable experience. And I think that it's really important for us to try to break down these barriers because, you know, again, people who live in poverty and the working class in general, we have far more in common with each other than we have with the people at the top of the pyramid, even if our skin tone looks similar. It doesn't matter, because race is not a biological thing. It's just something that we made up. And who gets to be white and who doesn't get to be white, it always fluctuates. And if you're banking on being white to cement your social status and that social status of your offspring and their offspring, that's a really shaky plan, is all I'm going to say there. But anyway, family members, I hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll talk to you some other time. Bye. Yes, it's cakey back there, if you didn't know.